Hello and welcome again to UCL Global Health. We have a very distorted view of Africa. I think many people think that Africa's development has been something that's only occurred in the last century. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Kevin MacDonald, who's Professor of African Archaeology at UCL, and you specialise particularly in West Africa.
That's right.
But this image is completely wrong because for example, what was West Africa like where you know about, say, 2,000 years ago?
Well, about 2,000 years ago, we already were beginning to have the first urban centres in West Africa.
So towns?
Towns.
So these weren't hunter-gatherer people?
No, these were cities of 10, 20,000 people in the early first millennium AD. And if we go back before that, into an area which is now the Mauritanian desert, there was a state contemporary with Kerma in the Nile Valley over in Sudan, in Mauritania called Tichit, or at least it's in a region known as Tichit. We're not really sure what it called itself. But there we have a very sophisticated social formation with hundreds of settlements and some things that would certainly be the size of towns by 1200 BC.
Wow. And an alphabet?
No. Literacy for West Africa came with Islam.
Okay. And so that's sort of Sudan's side and Mauritania. What about Nigeria? Would there have been towns in...
Well, in Nigeria, you have some of West Africa's earliest art traditions. You have the so-called Nok culture, which is in central Nigeria, around the Jos Plateau area. We have a very sophisticated figurative art tradition, terracotta tradition, by about 800 BC. And this is going hand in hand with early iron metallurgy in that area.
So these civilizations were every bit as sophisticated as anything in Britain?
At that time, yes. And it's one of the great pities. This is sort of something which does not really feature much in European or indeed American secondary school curriculum.
Is there a movement in Africa to rediscover this as an academic discipline, or not sufficiently?
Well, there are probably not sufficient practitioners for the amount of space and the amount of heritage, the amount of archaeology that has to be interfaced with. But at least in most African school systems, aspects of this past are taught. But again, not so much.
So if you come up to the Middle Ages or the pre-industrial era, do you study?
I work right up until the 19th century, so yes.
So at that time, before the colonial invasion of Africa, where we think history began, there were sophisticated governance structures, there were towns, there was art, there was ceramics, there was...
technology, outstanding metalworking. Yeah, there was all of that. And I think perhaps the European land grab for Africa in the 19th century came at the wrong time for Africa. A few centuries before, when Africa was at the height of its own internal empires, I would think that at that point any European attempt to control Africa would have been repulsed. So the great colonial scramble for Africa happened at a time where a number of factors, including the Atlantic slave trade and also trans-Saharan interventions, had broken down the older African empires, which more or less extended from Lake Chad to the Senegalese coast, say around 1300 AD or 1400 AD.
So actually this is another reason for Afro-optimism, if you like. At the moment the economists are all saying, look, this is the fastest growing region of the world, and there's much more reason to be optimistic about Africa than the press often report. But also from a historical viewpoint, if we can get over the aberrant colonial era, then there's every reason to hope that the structures of governance and civilization will re-emerge.
There's a great deal of sophistication and dignity at the heart of African society, which has a great antiquity. And I think a lot of the stereotypes generated during the colonial era have undermined this. And in a sense, Africa needs to remember itself.
So just tell me a little bit about archaeological methods and the way archaeology has changed, say, in the time you've been doing it, which is about 2 decades.
Well, for one thing, remote sensing is helping us a great deal, satellite imagery and so forth, for mapping out the distribution of settlements, for assisting us in survey, because after all, this is an absolutely vast area. And although we've been working very hard since the 1960s to catalog Africa's heritage, we probably have an idea of probably less than 50% of what's actually out there. There's a small number of African and foreign archaeologists working, and it takes a great deal of time to document all of this. But in terms of changes more broadly within the discipline, African archaeology has moved progressively from being more prehistoric in terms of the demography of its practitioners to working more and more on historic periods and occupying terrain which has been emptied by a shrinkage in pre-colonial African history as a discipline, and for that matter, in historical anthropology. So archaeologists have had to become their own historians, their own anthropologists, and we're progressively working on more recent periods, what might be considered African historical archaeologies, the past, say, 500 years.
So you've moved into the space that used to be filled by historians.
That's right, and we're doing the same sort of work. We're doing work.
Are you competing, or is it that the historians aren't
There
doing
are
it?
only a few left in the UK, so we are the place where one would come to study pre-colonial African history now, I would think. In terms of the group of permanently employed African archaeologists in the UK, most of us are what might be termed historical archaeologists here at UCL and other universities, and we do the same sort of work that historians had previously been doing, including collecting oral histories, being more deeply embedded in local communities, and also being led to an extent by community concerns.
But my final question, this raises some really interesting issues, because everyone says you should always learn from history, and if archaeologists have moved into the void that used to be occupied by history, we've got to learn from you guys. What do you think we've got to learn in development and the kind of attitudes that we have towards Africa and towards development? What can we learn from archaeology? Are we making some huge mistakes?
Yes, I mean, there are some gaffes which have been committed by European politicians, by UN officials who have a fundamental misunderstanding of the African past. Famously, Nicolas Sarkozy came to Senegal a few years ago and talked about Africa as being this timeless, undeveloped place, which is a complete nonsense. So there is a great deal to be done in terms of educating ourselves about Africa so that we have a better understanding of its past. But also, within development, it's important to realize that heritage is part of development. This is a battle that Africanists have been fighting over the past couple of decades, to have archaeology and history considered part of the development process, both for reasons of national dignity and unity, but also as a means of developing tourism, rather than this sort of Africa as safari park, Lion King sort of idea of Africa, where you have, most cultures of the world, for example, Disney has had